Howdy, everybody, and welcome to Meet the Aliens, Volume 8. Today, we're going to be talking more about disclosure. This big event that's supposed to happen this year or early next year. And supposedly, we've already seen the first stage of this process. But apparently, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And so what we're going to talk about today are some subjects that I think will put the disclosure situation into some context for people who may not know what the heck is being kept secret and what is the big thing that is going to be disclosed. Is it just going to be another bigger pile of grainy photos and weird videos? And old typewritten memos and transcripts of mid-20th century bureaucrats being puzzled about weird stuff in the sky and people running into weird beings. And they've got a lot of fancy terminology to explain what's happening. I think the best way to start this would be to start with the original whistleblower. The main dude. The man himself. A man named Robert Lazar. But in the ufology field, he's referred to affectionately as Bob Lazar. Good old Bob Lazar. And who's Bob Lazar? What did he do? Well, for a few years, Bob Lazar worked at a facility called S4, an underground bunker on a secret military base known as Area 51. Bob Lazar came out about working at Area 51 in the early 1980s, in 1989. And he's the source of a lot of the early lore about Area 51. Not all of it, though. Bob Lazar was not involved in the biological side of things. He never saw bodies or met an alien. Now, granted, that doesn't mean that they weren't around. According to Bob Lazar, the compartmentalization was so strict and so severe that people were only working on their one narrow focus area, and they weren't allowed to compare notes or stray away from their own assigned lab rooms. And Bob Lazar's one job was the propulsion device, the thing that could make the ship accelerate to 10,000 miles an hour in a split second. And the unfortunate part was it was basically a rectangular slab of featureless metal with a hemispherical dome of featureless metal sitting on top of it. No buttons, no bolts, no seams, no wires, no ports, just smooth, featureless metal material. And X-rays reveal a lot of complex microscopic devices inside of it. And so, of course, in the few years Bob Lazar was there, he said that they didn't make a lot of progress, although they did design some cool experiments to show what the devices could do, even though they had no idea how to really operate them, and they didn't understand how they worked at all. Now, let's back up first and talk about what Bob Lazar says about how he got there. Bob Lazar was still a grad student when he was hired to work at S4, at Area 51. He did not hold a PhD. He wasn't faculty at MIT. He wasn't a famous physicist. But he was hired by one. Bob Lazar worked with other engineers and labs in the area, and there was a very not secret and very public race that these guys would do over some flat desert space. And they would gather and they would test out ideas for their crazy vehicles to see who could win. And Bob Lazar, being a little competitive, I think, showed up with a little tiny Honda hatchback, one of those really tiny four-cylinder engine cars that they made in the 80s that could barely reach highway speeds. Well, Bob Lazar removed the hatchback and installed a fully functioning jet engine into the back of the car and he got the thing going like 300 miles an hour. Some crazy speed that was very dangerous for that frame and probably damaged it quite a bit. But he won the race, and he posed for a photo next to his car with the jet engine. Now, here's the interesting coincidence or synchronicity. I would assume that maybe slightly more than half of my listeners have seen the movie Oppenheimer by our good friend Christopher Nolan. Well, there was a character in that movie that you may remember, a guy named Edward Teller. Now, you may remember that in that movie, at the Los Alamos laboratory, Edward Teller was not too interested in making an atomic bomb. He was ready to jump ahead and go ahead and make the first H-bomb, which is orders of magnitude more powerful than what they were trying to build. Remember that Edward Teller was the guy who wanted to build an even bigger bomb, but was sort of stifled by Oppenheimer for practical reasons. And then after Oppenheimer fell out of favor with the newly formed Deep State, they chose Edward Teller to continue the work and to start developing the most powerful bombs possible in the early 1950s. And throughout the 60s and 70s, Edward Teller became a senior statesman in the Deep State and in the program. From day one, he was always a lot more aggressive, cold-blooded, and anti-communist. So he was seen as someone who could be relied on, not to tell the secrets. He was a guy who could be trusted to always play ball with the people in power, or whoever's in power, people or otherwise. And so, as part of Edward Teller's work supervising the program, he would visit these secret bases often. And Edward Teller came by Area 51, and he happened to see a copy of the local paper, and he saw the picture of this little wiry, nerdy guy next to the hybrid contraption that he had built. And Edward Teller was always on the lookout for maverick, not yet accomplished minds that he could pull into the program, because he had learned from Oppenheimer back in the 40s that it was a mistake to just go after the biggest PhDs that you could, because they were not reliable people. So Edward Teller was not looking for the next Albert Einstein to study his featureless slabs of metal that he had acquired that could do amazing stuff, but we had no idea how. And so Bob Lazar seemed to fit the profile of the kind of person that the program liked to hire. And I think that to some extent, Edward Teller may have seen a kindred spirit in Bob Lazar. And so Bob went through a long, lengthy hiring process that involved a lot of strange interviews and extensive background checks. And he was constantly assured that this would be a great opportunity and an amazing job. But unfortunately, they couldn't explain what he'd be doing, not in any detail whatsoever. And so Bob was young, hungry, ambitious, curious, energetic. So he was willing to go through the process. And sure enough, he finally received his badge and clearance to enter the underground S4 facility at Area 51. And so Bob was eventually shown what he would be working on, which was just that flat silver box and that featureless metal half hemisphere sitting on top of it. And that was the propulsion system from one of the NHI craft that had been retrieved. And on a couple of occasions, Bob Lazar was allowed to actually see and enter the craft that his propulsion system had come from. And they called it the Sport Model. It was basically a little gray disc that had 3 creepy little seats inside that were sort of printed as part of the floor. They just kind of rise up. Once again, there are no bolts or seams or parts. Everything is all one piece. Or you can just pick it up or pull it away from where it's sitting in its specially designed nook or cranny. Everything seems to be built all at once. Bob Lazar said that the first time he saw the craft, it filled him with dread. He said that stepping inside of it gave him a very strong, ominous feeling. What he described was what I would call the kind of feeling people get when they're in a house that's haunted. They feel a presence. They feel something that's not necessarily hostile, but definitely not friendly. And Bob Lazar said that he had that reaction, and he said it was strictly just a presence inside the craft. And there were no lights. Bob Lazar says that the technicians with the program actually just brought in those cheap halogen lights with the yellow steel tripods. Bob Lazar said it was really weird to see this otherworldly object. And coming out of the hatch are two bright orange extension cords for the lights that the humans had to set up inside to be able to see when they were inside of it. Now, this makes me think of the many times that people have described the actual craft as having some sort of mind. That maybe that lacework, miniature wiring type stuff that people see built into the walls of certain NHI craft, maybe that's the wiring for a kind of analog AI that controls the ship. At some point, we'll have to talk about the Rendlesham Forest incident, which occurred in the 1990s in Great Britain. And in that account, a Royal Air Force officer actually touches one of the craft and receives a very powerful psychological experience where he gets a message in his mind. That's a weird story, but just know that the craft are supposed to be very intelligent themselves. So Bob described the feeling of being inside the ship as, quote, "I shouldn't be in here," end quote. Maybe that was the ship itself, trying to give Bob and any other humans that came in there that impression, trying to communicate to them that, hey, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. Okay, so aside from some feelings of being haunted, what did Bob learn? Did he see anything interesting? Something that we could use to try to figure out what's going on here? Well, he did say that they were able to take the sport model out for a test flight, which basically means have it float up in the air, straight up, and then come back down. And they somehow did this through some kind of remote control, and Bob Lazar said that he was not allowed to know exactly how they were controlling the ship. And he was interested in how radio signals could actually get inside the ship. He was not convinced that they were using some sort of radio remote control because he knew that the ship kind of forms this bubble around itself that dramatically affects electromagnetic radiation. And so the idea that you could sit inside of one with a walkie-talkie while it's in flight and be able to talk to somebody through a normal radio wave, that would be doubtful, according to Bob Lazar. And if you want to know my theory as to how they were guiding the ship, take a listen to my episode on MK Ultra, because it looks like some sort of psionic connection, some sort of consciousness connection, psychic connection is required to activate the ship. And that's crazy. And Bob says nothing about that stuff because he doesn't know about that. The other thing that he talks about is their big discovery was the power source for what was giving energy to these tube-shaped objects that they were calling gravity emitters. Well, apparently the point of Bob's flat box and hemisphere metal dome was to bombard or energize a chunk of this substance called element 115. Meaning it's a very, very heavy element that doesn't exist in nature. Its atomic number is 115. So that means 115 protons, and then a complementary number of neutrons. And you might imagine that nucleus would have an enormous number of isotopes, meaning nuclei that have the same number of protons, but have different numbers of neutrons, or the protons and neutrons are in a different geometric configuration inside the nucleus. Now, that's something we have no idea how to do. Back in 1989, when Bob Lazar was talking about element 115, humans had not synthesized it. We had never seen it in nature. It was basically science fiction when Bob Lazar was talking about it. But then in the 2000s, a lab in Russia was able to synthesize it by taking another heavy element and bombarding it with neutrons until it turned into element 115. But it wasn't in one of these stable configurations. So our human-made element 115, which we called moscovium, our moscovium was so highly radioactive that it decayed in milliseconds. That's what I call unstable. However, according to Bob Lazar, the isotope of 115 that is manufactured by the NHI has a very stable, non-radioactive configuration. And if I recall, it has other strange properties related to electromagnetism, as in it's very difficult to detect because of its strange properties, and we don't know much about that. However, we do know that Bob Lazar, because of his big mouth and his difficulty with following the rules, he was eventually kicked out of S4, and for some reason, he was able to talk to journalists and say a lot of things publicly that the program did not want publicized. But there were two reasons why Bob Lazar didn't fall prey to the rash of mysterious deaths of scientists that occurred in the mid-'80s. Yes, it's happened before, folks. We've got one going on now, but apparently there was a purge of people who knew too much about the program in the late 1980s. So if that was going on, when Bob Lazar starts talking to a journalist in 1989 and gives a long interview where his face is blacked out
and his voice is altered, you know how they used to do that stuff.
It was very dramatic. So why didn't Bob Lazar disappear? They tried to scrub his educational record, and they definitely tried to hide the fact that he ever worked for the government. But the documents have come to light. It was funny. This is pre-internet, so there were a lot of little things that could trip you up when you're trying to erase someone's presence from an area where they worked for years. Sure enough, someone came up with a document that was just a phone directory of people working at S4. And what do you know? Robert Lazar is right in there. It looks like maybe they don't kill people over phone books. But there are definitely other things that can make you disappear. And you would think Bob Lazar was doing all of that. Well, it looks like there are two reasons why Bob Lazar is still alive. The first reason Bob Lazar is still alive is Bob Lazar, just the kind of guy he is. Edward Teller was a smart man. He saw that Bob Lazar just had trouble following rules. He had trouble with authority. And what that means is that Bob Lazar was very easily made into a kook, a fool, a crazy person. He just kind of fit that mold. It was easy to get people to dismiss his ideas. Plus, think about what he's talking about. Especially in the 1990s, this was considered pure tinfoil hat paranoid schizophrenic territory. And speaking of paranoia, there's a second reason why Bob Lazar is still alive. In the 2010s, Bob Lazar admitted on a podcast that he had squirreled out a tiny chunk of element 115, the NHI kind, out of S4, and he put it somewhere that only he knows where it is. And I think that's one reason why he is still alive. Because they're thinking, well, he's not a true liability in terms of what he can tell the public, because he only worked on the propulsion system for a little while and never really figured anything out about it, except that element 115 was really important. No human can create the version of element 115 that the NHI can. Only NHI have the ability to manufacture chunks of this super heavy metal in a configuration that's not radioactive at all. We can't do that. Not even the deep state or the program can do that, apparently. And the electrogravitic devices that humans use either another material that's not nearly as good. I've heard some sort of isotope of mercury will do it, but that's a rumor. And so once Bob figured out that the metal detectors and the radiation detectors would not be able to pick up 115, he smuggled out a chunk out of S4 and hid it away somewhere for safekeeping. Definitely not with him. He knows better than that. His place of residence has been mysteriously broken into and ransacked multiple times. So he knows better than to have it anywhere near him. What else did Bob Lazar find out? Well, he said that during that test flight, when the propulsion system was activated, it created a kind of shimmering effect around the ship. And here's the weird thing. He said that if you went under the ship while it was floating, and you looked up into the sky, directly at what is supposed to be the bottom of the craft, he says all you see is sky. He said that if you look directly into the path of the gravity emitter, that light bends around it in a way that you can't see the emitter. So basically, if the gravity beam is pointed at your eye, you can't see the ship. And so that's interesting. That explains a lot of the weird visual strangeness that occurs when people see UFOs. They shimmer and seem to disappear and all that stuff. So it appears that that is an artifact of their propulsion system, because it affects light. Another neat thing that Bob Lazar said he saw was during an experiment where he was allowed to work with another guy who was working on the tubes that actually focused whatever Bob Lazar's propulsion system was generating. It was focused and emitted through these tubes. And Bob Lazar said he knows very little about this part, which of course was the whole point, to compartmentalize things. But Bob Lazar did say he was allowed to watch a demonstration of one of these emitter tubes. And the way they did it was they took a little candle and put it on a table, and they lit it. And then everybody looked at the little candle flame dancing around. Well, they aimed one of these emitters at the candle flame. And then Bob Lazar says that all the guy did was rotate the device a little bit on its axis, and then all of a sudden, the candle flame stopped moving. He said the candle looked like it was frozen in time. And then the guy started to rotate it even more. And when he did that, the candle disappeared and turned into a black dot. All they could see was a golf ball-sized black spot where the candle used to be. But then, when the man took the emitter away, then all of a sudden the candle was burning on the table normally again, with the flame dancing like they would expect. Bob Lazar says he has no idea what was going on and how that worked, but that's what he remembers. And so, eventually Bob Lazar had to leave, as I said earlier. One thing he would do is that he knew when these test flights would happen, and he knew that in certain configurations, these things will produce light. And so he would invite friends to some hills overlooking the Area 51 ancient lake bed, and he would let his friends see the lights zipping around. And Bob Lazar got to be the cool kid that knew secrets, but that got him into trouble immediately. And that's why he eventually came out to the media and was branded a lunatic. Over the last 10 years, I think he's started to gain the credibility that he deserves. I mean, the man described things about Area 51 and S4, things that were confirmed by photographic evidence years later. So I think he's a very credible source. And one thing that makes him credible is the limit of what he knows. He clearly seems to be a product of good compartmentalization because he has a very narrow field of view into the program, of course, by design. And so Bob Lazar himself will likely not come up in any of the forthcoming releases of information. But the project that he worked on, I think, will definitely be discussed. The reverse engineering program. So Bob Lazar says that when he left, they hadn't made very much progress. However, a lot of sources say that by the late 1990s, we had made some progress, and we had developed a not-so-great electrogravitic device of our own, and that's where the black triangles come in. Now, black triangles happened to crop up right around the time that some other events happened that did actually involve NHI. And I'm going to claim that this ramp up in NHI activity and presence is directly related to our development of our own electrogravitic devices. Remember, they got all bent out of shape when we developed nuclear weapons. That was the first ramp up. The second ramp up appears to have been when we could put one of those nuclear weapons on an anti-gravity craft that could reach the other side of the world in a few seconds. That's kind of dangerous. And so now let's talk about the Phoenix Lights. This was a huge event that happened on March 13th, 1997. And I'm going to claim that this was a full-on NHI probing of our defenses to check out some of our new military assets. And so what makes me think that? If you watch any news clips about this event, you'll see a lot of things are left out. In fact, the name of the event itself is misleading. The Phoenix Lights. Yes, there were a lot of weird lights in the sky, but some of those lights were human-made devices. And the main thing that freaked everybody out, that everybody remembers, was a gigantic black boomerang that was so large, some people described it as a floating city. And the aircraft that saw it said that it was so large they could land their jet on it. So yeah, what was this about? This Phoenix Lights incident in 1997 was easily one of the biggest UFO sightings in history. Strange objects and lights in the sky were observed by thousands of people in the Phoenix area, and then hundreds of people saw this one particularly disturbing object, the one we just mentioned, the one that, according to witnesses, had a surface area that was equivalent to multiple football fields. Like one pilot said, he could have easily landed his jet on one of the long sections of the L-shaped boomerang ship that they were seeing. And based on a witness who was involved in the urgent scrambling of fighter jets over Phoenix to observe and intercept whatever this was. And this officer informant said that on the multiple occasions when this massive ship showed up, the United States would go to DEFCON 2. Now, as a reminder, for people who didn't grow up during the Cold War, DEFCON 4 is normal, and that means everything's cool. DEFCON is short for Defense Condition. So DEFCON 3 would be slightly elevated. The government is on alert for something that might be a threat. Keep your eyes peeled. DEFCON 2 means that a major threat has already been identified and we are moving into a possible nuclear response. So DEFCON 2 doesn't happen very often. DEFCON 2 is reserved for some serious situations. This is where we were when we launched the 1991 Gulf War, and this is where we sat for a long time during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Long story short, at DEFCON 2, we are spinning up our nuclear capabilities to respond to something very serious. Now, DEFCON 1 means that we're ready to launch. That's where we have hair trigger for full-on nuclear war. To my knowledge, and probably to the public's knowledge, we have never gone to DEFCON 1. Probably the closest we've ever gone would have been during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as far as we know. There may have been plenty of secret situations where we went to DEFCON 1, and we had the missiles fueled up, and some people had already inserted their keys, ready to push the big button on whatever missiles they were in charge of, waiting for the president's go-ahead. And of course, DEFCON 0 means we are in a nuclear war. We are fighting an existential struggle for survival. Obviously, we would have known if we had gone to DEFCON 0. Luckily, we haven't seen that one yet. But we did go to DEFCON 2 that night in March of 1997, and this Air Force informant mentioned that President Clinton was away from the White House on some sort of personal business, and he had to be called into a situation room so that they could discuss what was happening over Phoenix. So it's unclear exactly how much Clinton knew about what was going on, and it's still kind of a mystery, but I have some theories. So what do I think happened? Well, I think we brought more galactic attention to ourselves when we cracked the anti-gravity code. And it looks like, in the late 1990s, that's what humans had done. We had apparently, by then, developed our own really inefficient, clunky, inelegant type of anti-gravity solution. The propulsion system on the TR-3B, the Black Triangle, is supposedly an interlinked series of washing machine-sized mechanical devices that do something with mercury and high voltage and blah blah blah. This is what gives the Black Triangle its anti-gravity properties. But it's definitely a lot more work than what Bob Lazar was working with. Clearly, way back in 1933, we had NHI-built anti-gravity objects zipping around, but they used just that little rectangular plate and the metal hemisphere connected to these little tubular gravity emitters. And that's what powered the NHI-based models. The human-based models are apparently difficult to operate and maintain, and I imagine construct. We're not there yet, folks. And so I think that when we started launching our own anti-gravitics, and if you want to know more about this emergence of these new kinds of vehicles in the 1990s, you can look up the Belgian Wave. Belgian. The Belgian Wave was a series of mass sightings of these Black Triangle objects over Northern Europe. And to get an idea of how many of those things were out there and how brazen they were being, as far as being seen and recorded, bear in mind that this is the 1990s, well before a 4K camera was in everyone's pocket. In the 1990s, you had to go old school with actual film. And yet, we still have dozens of photos, really good photos, of these vehicles. And even back then, the rumor was that these were human-built. and that's still the consensus among people in ufology. And a lot of exotic human-made vehicles may have been zipping around Phoenix on that night in 1997, but it was only in response to an actual NHI vehicle, and that's the big one, literally, the one shaped like a gigantic black boomerang that many described as a floating city. Well, I don't know about you, but all this talk about Bob Lazar and Edward Teller and secret labs and anti-gravity technology, all of the talk on these subjects makes me think about one thing, and one thing only: gangsta rap. Good old 1990s hip-hop. What would it be like if a real G was involved in these government programs? How would that go? Now, a fair warning, this song comes with its share of profanity, but, it comes with the territory. You know how we do over here. But I promise, it's not as gross or over the top as what you might hear on, say, the Grammys, or another seedy production like maybe a Super Bowl halftime show. We're not going to go that far. We have standards. So, without further ado, let's experience the world premiere of the Crash Retrieval Crew's new hot single, Don't Worry.
That's some good stuff. Alright.
Flying Mach 20 overhead with the 40. Chrome in the cockpit, but you can't ignore me. West side UFO crash unit on patrol. Gravity emitter stuffed in the console. Now in the bunker faded with the thugs. Checking for the cams and sweeping for the bugs. Down in the skiff where they take off the gloves. Black bunch of business, weighing up the drugs. Floating through the walls, got the feds all shook. Crashing through the gate in the whip I took. Who shot you? Probably me in a cigar. A low orbit killer in a government car. Don't worry, got my AK tucked away. I crash UFOs all motherfucking day. Bitch ass graves better pray for a pass, or I'ma turn round and put a nuke in that ass. Edward Teller saw my man Bobby the Czar, and the jet engine he built on his car. But Bob ain't like the army, fought with the grass. Left 51 with 115 in his ass. Fit Majestic 12, them bitches got played. Punk ass suits kneeling down to the graves. Praying for power while the masses get erased. 11th hour doom, I see fear in their face. Talk slick, get zipped in the body back fast. Laser cannon flash, turn your convoy to ash. Catch a Vanna syndrome from the baseline tremble. Brainwave scramble when the SUVs assemble. Don't worry, got my AK tucked away. I crash UFOs all motherfucking day. Bitch ass graves better pray for a pass, or I'ma turn round and put a nuke in that ass. Don't worry, got my AK tucked away. I crash UFOs all motherfucking day. Bitch ass graves better pray for a pass, or I'ma turn round and put a nuke in that ass. Whack helicopter circle while I'm smoking indo. Watch the prophecies unfold through bulletproof window. You can't fade me, I'm beyond what you measure. I'm an interstellar outlaw, stealing hearts and treasure.
That's what I'm talking about. Crash retrieval in effect. Bitch.
Don't worry, got my AK tucked away. I crash UFOs all motherfucking day. Bitch ass graves better pray for a pass, or I'ma turn round and put a nuke in that ass.
We done immaculated your constellation.
Well, that was interesting. Can't all be bangers, folks. We do what we can do over here, And bear in mind that if gangsta rap is not your thing, we're going to be doing country and, unfortunately, heavy metal eventually. So, like the song says, Don't worry. But alas, there is a cause for worry. If you're out there and you're about to make a breakthrough in electrogravitics, if you're about to unite gravity with quantum theory, basically if you can make stuff float without using any sort of conventional Newtonian method, then the clock is ticking. You better worry. You better get a bug-out bag and put some water purification tablets and some pemmican in one of those silver space blankets, because you're going to be on the run for a little while. I mean, the sensor arrays that they have, the methods they have for tracking people down, are pretty effective. So you're not going to get very far. And we've already talked about Amy Eskridge. And the more I look into her, the more interesting this person is, because she seems to have been some sort of off-the-charts genius. And our old friend, Lou Elizondo, the former intelligence officer who worked for the Department of War, and who has been a very effective agent of the deep state in terms of soft disclosure, going around laying hints and telling people what's about to happen and what information is about to be released. And he said that he knew Amy, and that shortly before Amy was killed, she told him that she was preparing a demonstration of some sort of anti-gravity device that she was developing. So, I guess that takes away pretty much all of the rest of the doubt about why she would have been killed. That's kind of a slam dunk now. And I find it interesting that Lou Elizondo would acknowledge the murder of Amy Eskridge. And I think this hints more at the fact that these murders are not being done by the federal government. I think it's kind of weird that someone like me would be saying, hey folks, they're innocent. CIA is not doing this. I may be going too far with being that categorical, but Miss Eskridge herself said that she had strong indications that these were rogue private contractors. And then there's Neil McCasland, the Air Force officer who is still missing. And this guy, what do you know? He worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and he was in charge of Hangar 18, which is the legendary place on that base where they keep the goodies. The original material recovered from the crash site at Roswell in 1947 was quickly transported north to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And before Area 51 was constructed, it was the epicenter of the program. And there's a lot of evidence that General McCasland was in contact with ufologists and people who were handing information over to the media or directly to the public, including former Blink-182 frontman Tom DeLonge. Now, Tom DeLonge has been very active in the ufology community for years now, and he's still around, but I don't know. I'd be worried if I were him. Although, he's sort of safe in the same way that Bob Lazar is. Number one, they are easily discredited in the public because of their background or lack of credentials or titles. And they aren't actually building anything. And of course, in Bob Lazar's case, he has that chunk of Element 115 keeping him safe. Now, this all leads us to the big question. And the big question is, why? Why are they doing this? Why the push for disclosure? Not why are the NHI here? That's an old question I talk about all the time. I'm talking about, why does the deep state appear to be in a hurry to disclose information to the public? Why the rush? And remember, there's this old, persistent, widespread rumor in ufology and among informants like Lou Elizondo. And this rumor is that there's something special about the year 2027. Some global event in 2027 is going to catastrophically expose the program. It's going to just sort of rip the veil off, and everything will be laid out for the public. And so we have to imagine what kind of event would do that. Because I think it's safe to say that without some sort of extreme, unavoidable event, they would sit on this secret forever. They would never admit it. I think the fact that at least some major part of the deep state is pushing for the release of this information is actually cause for alarm. Because in a normal world, if things were going their way, they would keep chugging along, keeping the secret. I think if we take a step back and look at the apparent actions of elements within the deep state, we can do a kind of Sun Tzu or Sun Tzu art of war style analysis of the actions. And it seems to me that there's some sort of split within the program. And apparently these disagreements started in the 2000s when the last member of the original Majestic 12, the men who made the agreement with the Greys in 1954, they were all gone. And so now you've got younger people that are not as informed, who are all sort of scrambling to do what they think is best in these final hours. And so, what's the split about? What's the disagreement? Clearly, some element of the program is going to sit on this as long as they can. And they're actually fighting the presidential directive. The CIA is being very shady, as usual. So it's going to be a fight. But there are very determined people, including people who actually have influence and information on the program. And as long as we've got pressure from the inside, then there's a good chance that full disclosure might happen. But again, I worry about why it's happening. What's with 2027? A lot of people have been talking about the Truman Show hypothesis, and other people are talking about full-on alien invasion. But I think we've already been invaded. I think the invasion is over, and they won. Or at the very least, they definitely just moved in and started giving orders. But the UFO literature shows that they clearly need something from us. There's some kind of symbiotic or parasitic relationship going on here. Maybe we'll find out next year. And that's it for this volume of Meet the Aliens. I'm fairly sure we'll go back to another subject for next week, unless some new crazy thing happens related to our friends from out of town, as Lou Elizondo calls them. But we'll see what happens next. I'm feeling an odd combination of worry and excitement, that old mix of intrigue and fear, which I think is the bread and butter of conspiracy theorists like me. And then I take all that worry and anxiety and overthinking and tedious investigation, and I throw it at you. I hand it to you and say, deal with it. You worry about it. And that makes me feel a little bit better. That's a little insight into how I operate and why I do what I do. It's all for me. But I think that it might be beneficial for you guys in the long run, because over the next year, as the stuff about underground hybrid breeding programs and abductions, as people get freaked out about that, you can relax and say, I already knew about that. No biggie. Life goes on. We'll figure it out. And so we'll talk about more alien stuff in the next volume of Meet the Aliens, but we'll likely move on to another subject next week. And so, until then, talk to you later.